afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here, and I would like to thank Delphi Forum for bringing us together for this discussion. My name is Nektaria Stamouli, and I am the Eastern Mediterranean correspondent for Politico. In this panel, we're going to discuss, we're going to focus on Southern Europe and how it views the day after the war in Ukraine. And for this discussion, I have together with me a panel of distinguished guests, Mr. George Pagoulatos, who is the Director General of ELIAMEP for a few more days, I think, or he's also the newly appointed Greek ambassador to the OECD. So congratulations. We also have Charles Powell, who is the Director of Instituto Elcano in Spain, and Dorothée Schmid, the head of Turkey and Middle East program at IFRI Institute in France. So my first question to all of you would be, when I saw the headline of this panel, we refer to Southern Europe as if it has some kind of unity. And I was wondering, is this actually the case? Is Southern Europe a collective political actor within the EU and Mediterranean? And can Southern European countries play a collective role in the war in Ukraine more specifically? Mr. Pagoulatos, would you like to start?
Yes, I would say that the Southern European countries, or the Mediterranean countries, including France in that group, have a set of converging interests, but it would probably be far-fetched to say that they are operating as a collective actor. They usually tend to punch below their collective weight. They have collective interests, they have converging interests when it comes to common concerns. These are countries that have a strong commitment to European integration, to the deepening of integration. They have supported in various ways, in various degrees, what is called by many geopolitical Europe or open strategic autonomy. They want a deeper integration in Europe. They tend to have a common view when it comes to fiscal integration inside the Economic and Monetary Union. They want a more complete Economic and Monetary Union. And they have a serious concern when it comes to the Southern neighborhood, because that is the region that directly affects the stability of the European Union and in particular this group of Mediterranean countries. And this also means that they tend to be affected by migratory waves that originate from Europe's southern neighborhood, and they also tend to be on the first line of fire when it comes to the devastating effects of climate change. And we have seen these effects play out in a number of ways in a number of countries over the years in Southern Europe. Now, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, because this has been the main topic of focus, I would say what is important with the group of Mediterranean countries is that they have sided fully backed the common European stance of providing full support, military, financial, economic, diplomatic, political, to Ukraine, activating sanctions now on the 10th wave and beyond, even though they're not directly geographically affected, so to speak. They do not perceive Russia as a direct threat in the way that Poland or the Baltic countries or the Nordics tend to perceive. And that, I think, is very important because it creates a precedent of a common European approach when it comes to external threats faced by any European Union member country. In other words, what is a security threat for any European Union member state should be regarded as a security threat for all. This is a principle of European solidarity. In a way, a version of that, a harder version of that, is enshrined in Article 42, paragraph 7, the Mutual Defense Clause of the treaty, which is a very important acquis of the European Union, saying that if any member state is experiencing a direct threat, a direct attack by an external country, the other member state should come to its support by any means available. So in my mind, the readiness of the European South to support and to bolster and to uphold the common European stance against Russian aggression in support of Ukraine is not just a matter of defending European principles, which are also the principles of international law. It is also a matter of defending a deeper European Union and the acquis of moving towards closer integration in all these fields that I mentioned.
Thank you. Mr. Powell, do you agree there is a distinct approach that the Southern European countries have towards the war in Ukraine that distinguishes them from Central and North European?
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here. Let me just make a quick prefacing statement about our choice of words. We don't actually call ourselves Southern Europeans, right? We are the Med-9. And of course, that's because the word South carries a stigma with it, right? Within our own countries, the South tends to be less developed than the North. Within Europe, the South is often less wealthy and prosperous than the North. So we don't actually call ourselves a Southern bloc, we call ourselves the Med-9. It's a very heterogeneous bloc or grouping. Of course, France, Italy, Spain are big economies, and then you have countries like Malta and Cyprus. We have different threat perceptions, different political cultures. But despite this heterogeneity, as has just been said, I think we do have certain common attitudes. And let me just add something that wasn't mentioned earlier, which is the social dimension of the European project. Yes, we want strategic autonomy, both hard and soft, I think, military and foreign policy strategic autonomy, but we also want the soft version of strategic autonomy. As far as Ukraine is concerned, I was just looking at the list of provided by the Kiel Institute, which measures how much money all countries have been spending on defending Ukraine and supporting Ukraine. Military aid, humanitarian aid, economic aid. And it's interesting that the Med-9 are all within the 0.46% to 0.3% of GDP commitment to Ukraine last year. That's quite a lot. There are two outliers, Cyprus, 0.5%, and Malta only 0.25%. But considering that Spain, Italy, and France are all in that sort of 0.4% of GDP commitment, that's pretty impressive. Things are slightly different when it comes to giving Ukraine lethal weapons. Portugal and Spain and France, of course, are sending tanks. Italy has said it will not send tanks. And I was in Rome recently, and I was actually quite struck by the tone of the public debate about Ukraine. You know, in Spain, the Russian ambassador cannot show his face on television. In Italy, he's at it all the time. And I would actually argue that, private Italian media has been penetrated by Russian interests over the years. So the quality and the nature of the debate, I think, varies enormously from country to country. Having said that, as you've mentioned, I think so far the Southern European or the Mediterranean bloc has been steadfast in its support for Ukraine, and presumably this will continue to be the case. Though, as I just said, I am a little bit concerned about Italy in particular if the conflict drags on. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Schmid, what do you think?
Well, of course, I think my colleagues have said it all more or less, but I remember we've been sitting together a few months back thinking about this, trying to narrow together our interests in order to form a southern bloc, because as Georges said, we're clearly punching below our weight. But I think this has to do with the question of leadership also within the EU. All of these countries, some of them are founding member states of the EU. All of them have been, as Georges said, very faithful to the EU. They're in favor of deeper integration. They've been working on the reform of the EU, etc. But none of them, except with the exception of France, like to be on the forefront, like to be in the leadership. And I think the under-institutionalization of this Med-9 makes it like, of course, a marginal actor in some way. And now, when we come back to this issue of leadership, I think the Ukrainian crisis has shown that we're in search of an external leadership, because we cannot find it anymore within the EU. Because France also has this sort of controversial approaches to strategic autonomy that we're going to discuss further maybe later on. So it doesn't mean that France has ever been ambivalent in its support to Ukraine, but as you know, Emmanuel Macron has this, is very fond of this sort of non-aligned, Gaullian type of foreign policies, which made him enter in a rather narrow dialogue with Vladimir Putin before the war, And now, after, of course, his trip to Beijing, there are questions about his willingness to, sort of split the Western camp, whereas the rest of Europe is very much aligned with the United States, searching again, as I was saying, for leadership in the time of very strong crisis. And I'm just coming back from Istanbul, where I was attending an event that was organized by a German foundation, where there was super pro-NATO, Atlantist stance, and Emmanuel Macron's been super strongly criticized for advocating for the European Union. But at some point, one of the German participants said, the EU does not exist without NATO. And even if I sometimes can disagree with my president in terms of timing, I think it is extremely important to keep the difference between NATO and the EU. I stop there.
Thank you. Indeed, Macron triggered divisions in the EU with his comments in terms of what foreign policy you should follow. So, since you mentioned strategic autonomy, where does the war leave the European Union in this issue? What should NATO's role be in European security? And what will the next day of EU-Russian relations be after the war? Will there be any relations? What do you think, Mr. Pagoulatos?
Thank you. Where does it leave us with regard to NATO? The war, Russia's aggression against Ukraine has proven that in the face of an external threat of a systemic type, carrying nuclear weapons, NATO is the only game in town when it comes to European defense. This has been evident. It has been upheld by everyone inside the European Union. It is especially the reason why countries that feel directly exposed to Russian aggression, Russian threat, have clinched even closer to NATO, and some of them have are now in the process or have become new NATO members in the north. However, I do not believe that this necessarily means that European strategic autonomy should be placed on deep freeze. European strategic autonomy is about Europe developing its own unity of will and its own definition of a common interest, as well as the ability to defend its common interests and its common values. At times when some of these interests might diverge, occasionally, in some cases, vis-à-vis those of its closest partners and allies. There are areas, such as in Africa, for example, where Europe might find it important to intervene, but NATO might not find it important to intervene. Europe should be able to define its own interests in that sense. Now, this does not mean that this should operate in competition to NATO. Instead, it should bolster the Euro-Atlantic alliance and NATO by strengthening a European pole inside NATO. After all, this is exactly what the United States have been demanding, a European Union that takes its defense obligations inside NATO more seriously and is able to move towards closer defense integration and undertake more responsibilities in this area. So I do not find that at all antagonistic. Both of them can operate at the same time. And it's also important that the notion of open strategic autonomy reminds us that it's not just about defense and security. And security is not just about defense, it's about counterterrorism, about cybersecurity, a number of other areas. But it's not even about security, because it is most importantly about defending Europe's interest in a global marketplace, which is becoming increasingly Hobbesian, which is becoming increasingly fragmented. We live at the time of a reversal of the globalization, the big globalization trend, where the rules-based multilateral order is breaking down. From the moment we have a Security Council member, permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations invading another country in the way that it has, Russia, we cannot talk about real credibility of the international order, international law. In that environment, in such a Hobbesian world, Europe should be able to defend its values and its interests, and it needs the instrument to do that. Well, and the instruments are not just relevant with regard to defense. They also have to do with promoting its own technology initiatives, promoting its own autonomy with regard to being able to come at the cutting edge of industrial technology, of green tech, and also defend itself, defend European interests against protectionism on other parts of the world. So all this is part of a European strategic autonomy, and I think that the world that we live in following Russia's aggression reminds us of how valuable and how topical these pursuits are. Now, when it comes to, you asked about Russia. Russia is a rival, it is an aggressor, and I don't think that Europe can pursue anything else than the defeat of Putin's aggression against Ukraine. On the day after, Europe should be able to, if things change and Russia seems to be willing to be integrated in a global system, to pursue some sort of integration of Russia in a European security architecture, because Russia will remain a neighbor of Europe. Unfortunately, that is geography, and it is not in the interest of Europe that Russia becomes an extension, a security extension, strategic extension of China. It would be destabilizing and we would increase the security challenge, but we're very far from that. At the time being, Putin's aggression must be defeated.
Thank you. Mr. Powell.
Thank you. The EU-NATO relationship has always been somewhat schizophrenic, let's be honest. Right now, of course, all EU member states, save 5, are in NATO, following Finland's accession recently. And in the past, the distinction between what NATO and EU did was pretty straightforward. NATO did defense and deterrence, the EU did security. But actually, this division of labor had become somewhat blurred in the last 5 to 10 years. Now, I think the war has clarified this again. It's pretty clear what NATO should do and what the EU should do. Having said that, this doesn't solve all of our problems. I think the war has created a false sense of security. In a sense, the EU is back in the comfort zone of the relationship it had with the US in the Cold War because of Ukraine. And this makes a lot of people reluctant to talk about European strategic autonomy. But I think we need to keep this on the table for all sorts of reasons. First of all, because on the 5th of November, 2024, there will be a presidential election in the United States. What happens if the next president of the US is, once again, Donald Trump, who, as we know, had no respect or liking for NATO? He didn't believe in any kind of permanent alliances, and actively tried to undermine the European Union, for example, by encouraging Brexit. So whether we like it or not, strategic autonomy is on the agenda. But there's another reason why it should be. In the last 5 years or so, 5 to 10 years, something else has happened in the EU-US relationship, which has slightly gone unnoticed, partly because of our fixation with Trump. And that is that the gap between the EU and the US is wider than ever before. The economic gap has widened. The US has grown much faster. The EU has fallen behind. The technological gap has increased. The big 5 tech American companies dominate the European markets. The military gap has widened. It's true that in the last few years, in the EU, we've been spending a little more. But the gap is still growing because, of course, the US is spending much more than we are. So my main concern is that if this gap continues to widen, we will become irrelevant for the United States. Now, I think this should worry us for 2 reasons. First of all, because we want to be a relevant, the EU wants to be a relevant global actor. And secondly, of course, if it doesn't keep up with the US in any of these fields, the US will basically cease to take us into consideration. Now, as has been said, I think one of the things we need to do is to strengthen the European pillar.
The next session starts momentarily.
Strengthening the European pillar of NATO is positive for the whole of the EU, not just for NATO. We spend about 200 billion euros in defense every year, but we don't get much bang for our buck, frankly, let's be honest. The EU goal for common defense procurement is 35%. Currently, we are still at 17%. How many wars is it going to take for European governments and societies to take this seriously, to take joint procurement seriously? And finally, as far as Russia is concerned, I really don't think that we can think terribly constructively about the future. Will Putin be removed? We hope so, but of course the alternative, his successor, may be even worse than Putin. Let's not forget that. God forbid, but it could happen. Therefore, I think we should really concentrate on Ukraine. And as far as Ukraine is concerned, just very briefly, I think Southern Europeans, or the Med-9, are perhaps amongst the EU member states that are most willing to give Ukraine a serious negotiating mandate. We need to give Ukraine a European horizon. Why? Essentially for a very basic reason. We are going to spend billions of euros on Ukraine in the next 10, 20 years, whether we like it or not. And this money will be much better used if it's done in the context of accession negotiations. We have the methodology. We have the institutions, above all the European Commission, which does this for a living, for God's sake. The United States is pumping billions of dollars into Ukraine. There are serious concerns in Washington, by the way, about the Zelensky government and the Zelensky regime, which we are not paying too much attention to for good reasons. But frankly, if we have this methodology, we have these procedures in place in Europe, why don't we use them? And I think we need to answer this as soon as we can. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. Ms. Schmid, what do you think? How do you view Europe's security architecture after the war in terms of its relation with Russia? And also, if you want to add something in terms of EU-US relations?
So first thing, I could not more agree with what has been said, so my role is only to paraphrase what my fellow speakers have been speaking, but saying. But going back to my problematic with leadership, I think what Charles Powell mentioned, the perspective that Trump might be elected again, exactly enlightens what I was trying to say. The problem we have when Trump was in power was that NATO was without a father, basically, and we were all in search of a new father. And now that we've gained this sympathetic democratic administration that actually does not align at all with the European interest on a whole series of issues, we're still very, and especially now when there's a very acute security threat, we are now bound to again jump into the arms of the United States. But what we have to realize is that they have their strategic autonomy. We do not have ours, but they have. And especially, as George said, strategic autonomy also has to do with economy. The idea that the economic gap has been widening is extremely worrying, but I don't think it is a fatality. But it's true that the US have not been playing in a cooperative way on that side, definitely not. They're trying to widen again. They want to gain more, they want to make our handicap even stronger because they want to keep the leadership. So I think this is actually what probably Emmanuel Macron has in mind. I mean, I'm also trying to paraphrase what he says, what he thinks. But so we have to make the EU appealing. I think this is exactly what Charles was saying, that we have to make ourselves necessary. We have to make ourselves not only an accessory of the US strategic vision. And it is true that in the last 10 years, there has been this sort of blurring functions with, I've heard at some point, I remember very well the first time I heard that NATO was a place where you had political dialogue. And this sounded so strange. And now we've been working all about Europe's defense. And it is absolutely legitimate for both sides to play their interest in these two different venues. But there are different interests. I insist the Americans have their strategic autonomy. So maybe it's not fair that we're only wondering whether it's not only relevant, but is it legitimate that we think in terms of strategic autonomy? And if we think in terms of global geopolitics beyond the Ukraine-Russia war, the way the world is bound to be structured in the future geopolitically is either we focus completely on this sort of a new Cold War narrative, all things happening within Europe between Russia and ourselves, or we go back to this big grand narrative that the Americans were actually trying to take ourselves into before the Ukrainian war. And the Ukrainian war is in some ways only delaying, the emergence of the Asia-Pacific grand dominating structural narrative in the world. And what is our place? What is the role that we are going to play into that narrative? Because in some way, the Americans are embarrassed by what's going on in Ukraine, because they've had Russia on the way to their thinking about reorganizing their whole interest around the Pacific. So maybe this is only a moment in time, and this moment in time is, of course, much more stressful for us as we're closer to Russia. So to conclude, in terms of our relationship with Russia, I think in the end, it falls on the Europeans to settle and to defend the frontiers of the states in Europe, not on the Americans. So it means we will have to engage into not only some sort of strategical deterrent system with Russia, but also in a sort of political dialogue, a very strong one, but we have to make it clear that the constant revisionism of the borders within Europe is not only a matter of stress, but it's a matter of vital existence for the EU. And it's not because Russia is big that it's going to win in the end necessarily, because I don't think it's as politically structured as we are. We have our diversities, we have many difficulties to get together, but we have many resources and sophistication in terms of diplomacy that we can use also to dialogue with Russia. And I think in the end, it will fall upon us Europeans to organize this new balance with Russia and not on the Americans.
Thank you very much. One final issue I would like to tackle, we have around 2 minutes for each of you, 2.5, is the refugee issue. This has been a very central issue that brought together Southern European countries in the past, since all of them were first reception countries. So do you think that this is an issue that will be important in the months and years to come? And has the perception on refugees changed since the 5 million Ukrainians that Europe has absorbed in the last year, basically? Mr. Pagoulatos?
I don't think that the perception has changed when it comes to refugees. With the risk of sounding kind of blunt, I would say that the situation has sort of exposed our double standards when it comes to refugees. We are open to refugees as long as they look like us, as long as we believe that they can be culturally integrated and assimilated, they carry the same or a similar or a compatible religion and a similar cultural profile. Under these conditions, they're welcome. So we see, for example, 1.3 refugees in Poland. That's commendable, but that doesn't mean that Poland is more open when it comes to Syrian refugees or refugees from Africa. So the challenge of refugee movements to Europe remains the same as it was, and in fact, situations are even worse. The dynamics of destabilization in the MENA region are playing out. Climate refugees are bound to be added to the refugees resulting from civil wars and wars. We have constant fronts and areas of destabilization and wars. We see today what's happening in Sudan, for example. All this is washing out on Europe's shores and on Europe's political systems and societies, and at the domestic level, they tend to fuel the xenophobic and the far-right vote and the nativist reactions that we have seen in many countries. So I'm not optimistic at all. We are working on the dimension of protecting the borders, which is a very legitimate dimension, of course, and should be strengthened, but we're not working at all on the dimension of integrating refugees and creating legal avenues for migration in European societies and integration in European societies, where migrants can also be one of the responses to the demographic challenge that Europe is faced with. So I'm not very optimistic on that at all, I would say.
I'm afraid I have to agree. I don't think Ukraine has moved the needle at all. I think we've absorbed 8 million Ukrainians, by the way. So the EU can absorb 8 million Ukrainians without almost batting an eyelid. Spain has taken in 170,000. It's educating about 50,000 Ukrainian children, the fourth largest contingent in Europe, which is quite surprising given...
Compared to 1.5 Syrians. Huge difference in numbers.
So we can take in 8 million Ukrainians, but we can't take in several hundred thousand, 300,000 people from other parts of the world who are on our borders trying to get in, irregular migrants. In February, the EU had a summit on migration, and as you know, we're trying to complete the EU pact on migration and asylum. The Spanish presidency would like to wrap this up in the second semester of this year, but let's be honest, this is really the lowest common denominator. The only thing we can agree on within Europe is the externalization of this policy to countries like Turkey. That's really the only thing we can agree on. And the emphasis in the EU is completely now on border control and deterrence. We're not really dealing with the policy in the way that we ought to. And we've broken ranks. Greece signed a document with Malta, the Baltics, and Austria prior to this EU summit, advocating a hardening of our external border. And this, of course, is because politically this issue cuts in different ways throughout the EU. It's not an issue in Spain or in Portugal, for example. It's a hot potato in Italy and in Greece. So I don't think there's a Mediterranean dimension to this either, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Ms. Schmid, what do you think? Will this be an important issue? And since you focus on Turkey, what will the role of Turkey be? Do you expect this to change after the Turkish elections? First of all, Southern Europe, how do you see Southern Europe dealing with the refugees? And if you want to comment on Turkey as well. And
what is fascinating is that I think all Southern European countries, as has been said, have a very different perspective on that issue. In France, we've managed in some way to sort of completely isolate ourselves from the issue of political refugees, and the whole debate is concentrating on the economic migrations, which is considered as non-legitimate. So it's absolutely fascinating to me to see how there was an acceptance of the presence of some Ukrainian refugees with a sort of micromanagement and a lot of fuss about human management of it in the French media, whereas it's always dealt with extremely negatively when it comes to economic migrations. And when we think of on Turkey in France, we have almost no Syrian refugees, so we place probably the issue more on a diplomatic level. So I think definitely it is not working, but if it's not working, it means that we cannot have a southern EU bloc, because it's like the #1 issue that affects all the countries. We have to agree on definitions. I don't think the French are really playing their part correctly in terms of trying to find a sort of a common assessment of the difficulties and the common solution. But I think it also has to do with the specific common diplomacy that Southern European states, common diplomatic vision they can bring to the EU with regard to the development of Africa, which is the next, rising continent. I mean, the next one after maybe, of course, all the difficulties are over with Europe, Asia, etc. But of course, it has the mass of African migration has to do with the constant transformation of the continent. And this is something that we cannot protect ourselves staying on a national basis. So we will have no choice. And the way we're discussing it collectively within the EU, trying to share the burden between the North and the South, is not always working, because of course the perspective is very different, the migrations are different, there are political ones, there are economic ones, some people are in real danger. After the Brexit, the role of the UK is also very different. Maybe some of the refugees will want to settle in Europe and stay there more. And don't forget that the next elections in Turkey are bound to also have an effect on that, with Turkey, of course, trying to bargain to get more money to keep the refugees that it want to keep.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for this very interesting discussion.